Jones versus Combs, part 17. We're almost done, y'all. I cannot believe it. So we left off with again going to the 15th cause of action against defendants Lucian Charles Grange, Ethiopia, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group. And they're saying that they should have took a cue from Jeffrey Epstein when the federal prosecutors arrested and prosecuted him around July the 18th of 2019. So it says, on or about that date, the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Southern District of New York indicted Epstein and unknown associates, which, guys, that list still has not been released yet, for violating the TVPA. Later on, or about June the 29th of 2020, the same office indicted Epstein's co-conspirator, Jesselyn Maxwell, for conspiracy to entice minor victims to travel to be abused by Epstein. Mr. Combs, defendants Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and her direct reports, Brendan Paul, Frankie Santella, and Moy Bion, all engaged in the same activities as Mr. Epstein and Miss Maxwell. In fact, Mr. Combs, defendant Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and her direct reports may have done worse. Wow, y'all. They may have done worse than Jeffrey Epstein. That's pretty bad. By providing financing for Mr. Combs' sex trafficking organization and concealing its actions thereafter, defendants obstructed, interfered with, and prevented the state and federal government enforcement of the TVPA against Mr. Combs. Defendants Justin Combs, Coram, and her direct reports, to the extent that the federal government was able to ultimately charge Mr. Combs, defendant Justin Combs, Coram, and her direct reports with TVPA violations. The filing of those charges were delayed by the defendants Lucian Charles Grange, Ethiopia, Motown Records, Love Records, and Universal Music Group's actions. Because of that delay, Mr. Jones was coercively caused to engage in commercial sex acts. As one example of how the defendants attempted to obstruct, interfered with, and prevented state and federal government's enticement of the TVPA, defendants provided large amounts of cash to Mr. Combs and his associates so that the coercive commercial sex acts would escape the detection of state and federal law enforcement and prosecuting agencies. Defendants provided large amounts of cash to further the Mr. Combs, defendants Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and her direct reports, sex trafficking venture, and with the purpose of helping Mr. Combs, defendants Justin Combs, Christina Coram, and direct reports evade criminal liability for violating the TVPA. As an example of how defendants attempt to obstruct, interfered with, and prevented state and federal government enforcement of the TVPA, defendants failed to timely file with the state and federal government the required tax forms that detail the sponsorship and partnership payments provided by the defendants to Mr. Combs. Timely filing of these reports is required by the United States Tax Code and related laws and regulations. These reports are tools that the state and federal government uses to detect and prosecute, among other illegal activities, sex trafficking in violation of the TVPA. By failing to timely file the required tax reporting documents regarding Mr. Combs' sponsorship cash transactions, defendants attempt to obstruct, interfere with, and prevented the government's enforcement of the TVPA by concealing from the government's attention Mr. Combs' cash transaction in aid of sex trafficking. By providing large amounts of cash to Mr. Combs and his associates, defendants intended and knew that Mr. Combs' coercive commercial sex acts would escape the detection of law enforcement and prosecuting agencies for some period of time. Defendants provided large amounts of cash to further the Combs sex trafficking venture and with the purpose of helping Mr. Combs evade criminal liability for violating the TVPA. Defendant's obstruction, attempted obstruction, interference with, and prevention of the law of the enforcement of the TVPA were all done intentionally and knowingly. For example, defendants knew that Mr. Combs was high risk, specifically high risk to violate the TVPA through continuing criminal sex trafficking activities. As evidenced by Cassie Ventura's civil complaint, she informed members of Mr. Combs' parent label about the abuses he was visiting upon her. And instead of coming to her rescue, they forced her to return his calls and to return to his sex trafficking enterprise. Defendants were aware Mr. Combs had a laundry list of criminal charges and barely escaped serving prison time. Upon information and belief, Mr. Combs engaged in witness intimidation and bribery to escape criminal liability for shooting Natalia Rubin in the face. And that goes back to, that whole nightclub thing, you guys. Defendants were aware that there were public allegations that Mr. Combs' illegal conduct was facilitated by several named co-conspirators. They were made aware of this through complaints made by Cassie Ventura and the lawsuit by former Diddy sex worker Jonathan Oddie. Defendants concealed from state and federal government its numerous cash payments to those co-conspirators. Defendants it continued its affirmative conduct of providing cash to Mr. Combs and his associates so that he could make these cash payments to his co-conspirators with knowledge that such cash transaction did not produce a clear paper trail. Defendants' intentional conduct attempted to obstruct, in many ways interfered with, and prevented the enforcement of the TVPA by investigators and prosecuting agencies. Defendant's relationship with Mr. Combs is providing to his sex trafficking venture with vast sums of cash each year went far beyond a normal and lawful sponsorship, partnership, and employer-employee relationships. Defendants knew and intended that its relationship with Mr. Combs will go far beyond a normal music industry relationship. Defendants knew that its decision to go beyond a normal music relationship with Mr. Combs obstructed the ability of law enforcement and prosecuting agencies to enforce the TVPA. Defendants' obstruction of the government's TVPA and other law enforcement efforts were intentionally and willful, and therefore defendants intentionally and willfully caused Mr. Combs' commission of the forcible commercial sex acts with Mr. Jones through its obstruction supporting the concealment of Mr. Combs' sex trafficking venture. Defendants knew that Mr. Combs and his other co-conspirators would use means of force, threat to force, fraud, coercion, and a combination of such means to cause Mr. Jones to engage in commercial sex acts. Defendants knew, acting in reckless disregard of the fact, and should have known that its obstruction in violation of 18 Code would directly and proximately lead to unlawful coercive commercial sex acts by Mr. Combs with men like plaintiff Jones, young men, women, and young girls. Defendant's obstruction has caused Mr. Jones serious harm, including without limitation physical, psychological, financial, and reputational harm. That harm was directly and proximately caused by the obstruction, and the harm resulting from obstruction was foreseeable. Defendant's obstruction has caused Mr. Jones harm that is sufficiently serious under all the surrounding circumstances to compel a reasonable person of the same background and in the same circumstances to perform or to continue performing commercial sexual activity to avoid incurring that harm. Wow, you guys, we are almost done. We're going to have one more part after this. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe. And let's go on to it should be part 18 by now.